Hi everyone, my name is Sam Reddy, and the topic of my group is carbon markets. What will we be discussing today? We will be discussing today how carbon emissions are causing environmental problems and global warming, how the carbon market works, how the carbon market can help with sustainability, and the Kyoto Protocol and why USA has not made the carbon market as big as it should be. We will also be talking about the carbon markets around the world and problems with the carbon market, and finishing off with the solutions on how the government can increase the carbon market industry. Alright, so let's dive right in. So, I'm sure many of us are familiar with the term global warming, but what exactly is it? It is, the, it is essentially the long term heating of Earth's climate system observed since the pre industrial period between 1850 and 1900 due to human activities, primarily fossil fuel burning, which increases heat trapping greenhouse gas levels in the Earth's atmosphere. It is the burning of these hydrocarbon fuels that results in massive amounts of CO2 being produced. And why is it so bad? This is terrible because when more CO2 is released into the atmosphere, more heat from the sun is trapped in the atmosphere, increasing global temperatures, leading to temperature increases in ocean water, which results in rising levels from melting glaciers and increased amounts of natural disasters like hurricanes, flooding, etc.
Now, the economic repercussions of global warming. Now, with warmer oceans, you have movement and population reductions in wildlife populations, right? With that, you get negative effects in the fishing or hunting industries as you have less product. With more natural disasters, the government has to spend more money on disaster relief to, relieve the damages. And with rising sea levels, you're losing land that you can use, and the property on that land is being destroyed. So, again, losing money, losing space.
So, what exactly is the carbon market? Well, to simply put it, it's putting a price on carbon emissions, which means you're making money off of being sustainable. Now, the carbon market isn't new, but it is a rising industry today. There isn't much distinct definitions on how these markets actually should work, as every country differs between regulations. But there are terms that you should be familiar with when you hear about the carbon market, and that is carbon credits and carbon offsets. The main difference between the two is that carbon credits stand for the right to emit that carbon, while the carbon offsets represents the production of a certain amount of sustainable energy to counterbalance the use of fossil fuels. So, when you hear about the carbon market, the first thing you would hear about would be carbon credits. Carbon credits work like a permission slip. A carbon credit is a permit given to a firm allowing them to produce a certain amount of greenhouse gases, usually measured at 1 ton of CO2. For example, if the government set a limit on how a factory can emit carbon, like 100 tons, but a company only emits 70 tons, they could sell the remaining 30 tons to other companies or save it up to use another time. So instead of forcing firms to produce at a socially optimal quantity, which could create a lot of deadweight loss for that business, carbon credits provide an incentive to produce less while still making profit. So let's take the Corporation as an example. This company is a leading power producer and operates some of the most polluting power plants in the US. This includes the coal-fired Martin Lake and Park Grove power plants in Texas. Currently, they are producing with a negative externality. In a bid to reduce its carbon footprint, Vistra has announced that it will close all of its coal-fired power plants in Illinois and Ohio by 2027 as it transitions to renewable energy. By participating in the carbon market and saving carbon credits, Vistra can gain some of the money they would have lost from reducing their production, since the money they can make off of carbon credits can alleviate part of their opportunity cost. Now, going off to carbon offsets. Carbon offsets work a little differently to credits, but are similar nonetheless. Carbon offsets are also measured by 1 ton of CO2, but different from the condition for carbon credits where the company emits less carbon than their limit. The carbon offsets are created when a business or company decides to invest in something to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, excluding their everyday operations. So, organizations with operations that reduce the amount of carbon already in the atmosphere, say by planting more trees or investing in renewable energy, have the ability to issue carbon offsets. These include projects such as reforestation, building renewable energy, and waste and landfill management. Now, to know the true difference between carbon credits and carbon offsets are the markets in which they regulate in. So, one is a regulated market, otherwise known as the compliance carbon market, which is set by cap and trade regulation at the regional and state level. So, right now, the global compliance market for carbon credits is massive. It is at $851 billion right now and is still growing. Now, carbon offsets work in a voluntary market. The purchase of carbon offsets is voluntary, which is why carbon offsets form what's called the voluntary carbon market, as said before. However, by buying these carbon offsets, companies can measurably decrease the amount of CO2. But as said before, it's a voluntary market, so it is not required by law, so there isn't much regulations in it.
So, why isn't the carbon market as big as it should be in the United States? There are a few reasons for the lack of carbon market in America. The first of which is the US's refusal to take part in the Kyoto Protocol, which we will go into detail later on in the video. US refused to take part in the Kyoto Protocol because the Senate refused to ratify it, citing potential damage to the US economy required by compliance, since the US would have to reduce its carbon emissions while developing countries would not. The next reason is determining the amount and price of carbon credits. Governments determine how many emission credits are made available in a carbon market, and setting this number is critical. If there are too many emission credits available, covered entities have less incentive to reduce emissions because the credits are so easy to attain. Alternatively, if there are too few emission credits available, covered entities are forced to adapt their operation technologies to be less emission intensive more rapidly, which can be expensive and can sharply increase prices for consumers. And the last of many reasons is environmental justice implications. Carbon markets allow covered entities to trade emission credits, meaning that pollution rates can end up highly uneven. For instance, one power plant could buy up a large proportion of the market's available emission credits, which would then allow that power plant to pollute at a much higher rate than others. Power plants do not only emit greenhouse gases, they also release co-pollutants. These co-pollutants have enormous public health impact, ranging from cardiovascular and respiratory problems to premature death. Because most power plants and polluting entities are situated in or near low-income communities and communities of color, the increased pollution in certain locations will harm those communities disproportionately.
Of the Kyoto Protocol was to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous environmental effects on humans with the climate system. The countries that are involved with the Kyoto Protocol are Australia, China, Russia, Japan, and every nation in the European Union. This protocol was one of the first international agreements to reduce CO2 emissions. The main objective is to reduce the amount of harmful chemicals that are released into the atmosphere by establishing a structure of rolling emissions reduction commitment periods for countries to abide by. This includes minimizing impacts on developing countries by establishing an adaptation fund for climate change, establishing legally binding commitments to reduce emissions for greenhouse gases, as well as establishing a compliance committee to enforce the actual protocol. The Kyoto Protocol sets a limit to how much carbon emissions that are created for nations, and then applies a rigorous monitoring/verification system so that all parties under the protocol are held accountable. So, how did the Kyoto Protocol affect the world? Well, between 1990 and 2012, the original Kyoto Protocol parties reduced their CO2 emissions by 12.5%, which is well beyond the 2012 target of 4.7% for CO2 emissions and greenhouse gases. The Kyoto Protocol was therefore a huge success at the time. As you can see by the graph, the Kyoto Protocol versus other parties have reduced themselves by 12.5%. Although within the long term, the Kyoto Protocol did not really create such a significant impact upon global warming due to the limitations not being substantial. However, by having more nations sign the protocol, it could potentially have a big impact on global warming, as well as having better limitations towards each nation on how much greenhouse gases they can utilize. So overall, the Kyoto Protocol didn't really have a great long-term effect. However, within the short term between 1990 and 2012, it had a pretty significant impact by reducing 12.5% of carbon emissions um, within the certain parties that are part of the protocol.
Now, was the Kyoto Protocol a success or failure? The US did not sign the protocol as the US Senate cited concerns over carbon reductions affecting the US economy. Although Australia, China, Russia, Japan, and the European Union did sign on. But overall, looking back today, CO2 emissions have increased overall since then. So you could say that it was a failure as CO2 has not been stopped. But you could also argue that there is a symbolic value as it shows that the world could somewhat unite together to fight global warming.
Carbon markets and cut climate pollution, developing the power of market forces to reduce carbon pollution down to create investments in low carbon technology. Carbon markets are now underway in over 50 jurisdictions around the world. Two nations that are heavily affiliated with carbon credit and carbon reduction is China and the European Union. Of course, there are many more around the world. However, I decided to focus on these two nations. China recently has launched the world's largest emissions trading system, which will result in a significant chance of China's carbon emissions reduction. China's objective is to cover majority of their energy-related emissions and provide cost-effective, market-driven support to CO2 emissions reductions so they can eventually become climate neutral by the time of 2060. Currently, China is producing 9.9 billion metric tons of carbon emissions. However, they truly believe with their new emission trading system, they will hopefully be net zero for carbon emissions by 2060. For this to occur, they need to have serious limitations and increase environmental friendly electricity/energy technology to run China. Let me go into the European Union. The European Union has developed an emission trading system called the cap and trade system. The EU emissions trading system works on the cap and trade principle. A cap is set on the total amount of certain greenhouse gases that can be emitted by the installations covered by the system. The cap is reduced over time so that total emissions fall. Within cap, installations or receive emission allowances, which can then be traded with one another as needed. The limit on the total number of allowances available ensures that they have a value. After each year, an installation must surrender enough allowances to fully cover its emissions. Otherwise, heavy fines are imposed towards that nation. If an installation reduces its emissions, it can keep the spare allowances to cover its future needs or else sell them to another installation that is short of allowances. Trading brings flexibility that ensures emissions are cut where it costs leads to do so. A robust carbon price also promotes investments in innovative low carbon technology. So, from 2008 to 2016, EU carbon markets saved a total emissions of about 1.2 billion tons of CO2, which is pretty effective for them in reducing carbon emissions.
Now, how do carbon credits help the world? As we progress forward, there will be more and more regulations and limits on carbon emissions, a good example being the Paris Agreement. Now, there are countries and or firms within those countries that cannot meet these limits technologically speaking. To help mitigate losses from that, these firms can use carbon credits. In the year 2020, the global carbon market grew 20%, so it is now approximately $271 billion. While in the US, the market grew about 16%, making it a $26 billion market. Why hasn't the carbon market been picked up as much? A main reason is because the US never signed the Kyoto Protocol. Now, there are 12 states within the US who do use carbon markets, those 12 being the 11 from the Northeast and California. Now, what do the critics say? Many environmentalists and critics believe that carbon credits are more like a small remedy for climate change, as if it's a small band-aid for the issue that's global warming, instead of a full solution. Many believe that carbon credits just don't do enough to solve the massive issue, which is global warming. And so, for it to do like a bigger dent or do a better job, you'd have to use it more widespreadly.
Solution. What can the government do? If the voluntary market is going to be effective at helping achieve the targets of the Paris Agreement, it is going to have to implement either government action or individual or company internal reduction. By government action, we mean the government can add more regulation. Yes, Republicans are going to be mad if the government does that, but hear me out. A few angry people in exchange for the health of the planet seems like a fairly good deal to me. What kind of regulations or policies could the government implement, you say? They can add regulations that will still allow companies to profit, so large corporations can't argue if they claim to be eco-friendly. Currently, all the government is doing is financing carbon capturing projects and publishing data to help agricultural businesses capitalize on the market. Perhaps if they increase the financing for these projects, we could see some significant change in our emissions in the future. In addition, ratifying more acts like the Growing Solutions Act help farmers, ranchers, and foresters learn about carbon markets and sell carbon credits through a third-party certification process overseen by the USDA, which should in theory greatly reduce carbon emissions, at least in the United States. That concludes our presentation on carbon markets. I hope you enjoyed. Thanks for watching.